I am Anna Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach. And on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the cycle of generational trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, motherhood is political, parenting policy, and cultural expectations. Have you ever wondered how the experience of motherhood changes depending on where you are in the world and how much of it is shaped by culture, politics, and community rather than just personal choice? Today's conversation might just change the way you think about parenthood, support systems, and policy. I'm thrilled to introduce my guest, journalist Abigail Leonard, who spent nearly 7 years raising her children in Japan before returning to the United States. Abby didn't just live these experiences, she studied them, compared them, and brought stories from mothers around the world together to highlight something essential. Motherhood is not just a personal journey, it's deeply political and profoundly cultural. In this episode, we dive into the surprising differences between parenting in Japan, Finland, Kenya, and the United States, how cultural norms, gender roles, and government policies either support or strain new mothers, why recognizing the broader systems around motherhood can actually bring a sense of freedom and connection. You're not alone and you're not doing it wrong. Plus, we'll explore the power of community, the push for paid maternity leave in the United States, and how small collective actions could reshape the future for families everywhere. Abby also shares personal, touching moments from awkward daycare conversations in Japan to the validation she found in creating community through storytelling. If you've ever felt isolated in your parenting journey or curious about how other societies do it differently, this conversation is for you. Let me tell you a little bit about Abigail. She is an international reporter and news producer, previously based in Tokyo, where she was a frequent contributor to NPR, Time Magazine, and New York Times Video. Before moving to Japan, she was a staff producer for PBS, ABC, and Al Jazeera America. Her reporting focuses on issues that impact women, including the Japanese Me Too movement, Japanese salary women, caregiver spouses of injured veterans, and women who give birth in private prisons. Her work has earned a National Headliner Award, an award for excellence in healthcare journalism, an Overseas Press Club Award, and a James Beard Media Award nomination. Please enjoy, and thank you for listening. Hi, Abby. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
This is really exciting. I am an international person. I'm interested in this topic, parenting across the globe and how people do it in different parts of the world, because I lived in 4 countries myself, but I've been a parent only in one, the United States. I also covered this topic on the podcast many times before. Most recently, in episode 445, we talked about what cultures around the world can teach you about parenting with Marina Lopez. She wrote a book. She talked about 11 countries. Her book, I think, is called Please Yell at My Kids. It was interesting learning about different cultures, but Japan was not represented in her book. And Japan has been one of the countries that I've been always fascinated with since I was 15. So when I saw that you lived in Japan and you talk about Japan, I'm like, yes, I really want to learn more about this. So tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you end up in Japan? You birthed your children in Japan and now
Mhm.
you're in the United States. Just give me a little overview of who you are and how you ended up there.
Yeah, sure. So I was living in San Francisco at the time before we moved to Japan, and I'm a journalist. And so I was covering American news. And my husband does renewable energy work. So he was doing actually a lot of work in Tokyo. They were building a lot of new renewable energy stuff there. And so he was sort of going back and forth. And I was pregnant with our first, and we sort of talked about it and what made the most sense, whether it would be for him to sort of like be traveling so much when we had an infant or, to actually move there. And I wasn't totally sure, and I'd never had a kid before. So, this kind of questions like, how do you answer? But I decided, like, yeah, maybe we should just all move to Japan. I was 6 months pregnant. And, at the time I thought maybe it would be like a year or two. And so it'd be sort of maternity leave. I would go back to work, reporting Japanese news for an American audience. It sort of made sense in my head. But, having a kid is a really big change in your life. And so adding that to a new country was pretty hard. And yeah, so we ended up staying there for almost 7 years, and I had two more kids there. So I had all three of my children in Japan, and now we're back in the US. And I've sort of written a book to, in part, understand for myself sort of what that experience was all about and look at other mothers around the world and how they raise children in different countries.
Yeah, I mean, the first year of motherhood is the most challenging, I feel like, from my own life as well. I did a podcast episode and I call it the dark side of motherhood. And like no
Mm,
one talks about this. But I cannot imagine going into a different country like Japan, right? It's a completely different. If you went to the United Kingdom or something like that, it
yeah.
would still be somewhat familiar. But I think the contrast must have been enormous. What I liked about your book? First of all, I liked the stories of four women in those four countries. But what I really loved, your message was we shouldn't look at motherhood or parenthood apart from societal, cultural, political issues. And that was like, wow,
Mm.
yes, you're right. So I want to ask you, what have you learned? What are some of the biggest lessons or messages? What did you know before you started this project on and what did you end up learning? Did you have some ideas and theories and they were debunked? Or like, tell me about those big realizations that you had after you completed this project.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it was really hard to raise children in a country and a culture that was so different from my own, and it has very different, gender roles and views about sort of what mothers should do. Even like with birth, views about pain medication. In Japan, very few women have access to pain medication during birth, and there's sort of an idea that it comes from a Buddhist idea that pain bonds the mother and child, and that sort of carries through to the rest of, child raising, just that women are supposed to be, to some extent, self-sacrificing. And, that's I found it difficult. I wasn't even, I'm not Japanese. So in some ways I could sort of get out of some of this stuff, but it's just, it's hard. Motherhood is hard, but there's also a way in which it's sort of venerated as a profession almost. Like there's a certain amount of respect for it. And so I thought it was very interesting to sort of have that as my first experience of motherhood and then come back to the US and sort of see how completely different it is here. And there's sort of this expectation that women will work and have careers, but also balance that with motherhood. But you don't really talk, as you said, about sort of how very difficult that first year of motherhood is. And there's just this sort of sense that, you just like carry on and go to work and do as well as you can. And you don't have the supports that a lot of other women do in different countries. And that really makes an enormous difference. So the idea with this book was to sort of see on an individual level how these big societal structures affect women. And I mean, it was just very obvious. So I did Japan, Finland, Kenya, and the US. And so in Finland and Japan, they have close to a year and a year parental leave. And just that ability to spend time with your baby for that long and not have to think about going back to work. I mean, and all the things that go along with it, like pumping. There's no pumping really in Japan or Finland. I mean, just these things that we think of as like sort of normal everyday parts of motherhood, but that are totally onerous and difficult, they come from these larger places, And then, so I was watching this woman in the US struggle with a lot of this stuff. She couldn't afford childcare, so she asked her parents to take care of her daughter, but that added like 2 hours to her commute every day. Her parents are older, they take care of her disabled brother. I mean, it's just everyone gets involved in this, makes life just that much harder because we don't have things like paid leave or accessible childcare. So accessible, affordable childcare. And you just think about that and you see it. And then you look at places, Finland, it's not perfect, but there are so many things that alleviate the daily stressors. Even like before you have a child, the public health system, they have mothers come in for a meeting with a public health nurse, but it's essentially like a therapy session to talk about sort of their own childhood and what they want to do different with their kids' childhood. And so it's a way to like break intergenerational trauma that's, publicly funded. It's just sort of incredible to think that these things exist. And then here we are sort of like suffering through the day to day in some ways. And, just think that there's a lot of stress that new mothers take on and think is their own responsibility or their own failure. And it's not. There are these much bigger pieces that are out there. And one last thing I would say that I think was really interesting was that a lot of the solutions to the sort of postpartum difficulties, these different places around the world came up with the same solutions. Like you have in Kenya, there's this 1 month postpartum time when traditionally women from the community come in and bring sort of medicinal foods and you have a lot of social interaction. And I talked to a 91-year-old woman who just like recalled her postpartum time with such joy. Like it was this lovely time for her. And then in Japan, there's like a similar practice, sitting the month you sort of stay inside and your mother or other women care for you. And there's a lot of knowledge transmitted from older women in those situations. And so you just think like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel on this. Societies around the world have thought about what women need and come up with these solutions. And, I do think we should think about ways to incorporate that sort of knowledge that's come down through the generations. And now in modern life, we're like alone and struggling. I mean, not everyone universally, but there is a lot of difficulty with this time. So anyway, my message to women is like, it's not you. You're part of a larger system. And yeah, you need to sort of think about ways to connect with that, I think.
Yeah, it comes through that message loud and clear in your book. How would you describe your own motherhood, like in a few adjectives in Japan, like the first year?
Sort of like overwhelming and lonely. I had some good friends who I met through the sort of expat community. And I think that was really what got me through. They were just incredible women who were also first-time moms, and that was really, really good. So in that way, friendship was also really important, especially because we were all away from our families. But in other ways, yeah, I think it was pretty isolating. I went and I didn't really know the language yet, and I was trying to take language classes and, I couldn't even remember English. I was so sort of like tired. But so just sort of being cut off from the mothers at the playground, it was sort of hard to communicate. So that it was definitely hard and confusing, I would say. There were things I would sort of read online or talk to my friends back home about how American mothers did things like even, sort of later in the year when Japanese mothers were starting to sort of co-sleep or sleep close to their baby, that sort of stuff. And then in the US, it was sort of, you're not supposed to do that. And there are rules about safe sleep in Japan as well. But just these like sort of trying to figure out how to have a baby, how to feed it, how to feed him. It was a boy, how to sleep, how to, even like how warm he should be. There are ideas about like how to clothe them that are very culturally based. So I think it was pretty hard to sort of navigate that kind of stuff essentially alone. But the thing that I did come out realizing that I think was positive was that there's so many different ways to do this. Like so many different cultures have, thoughts about child raising, and it gives you a certain amount of freedom too when you realize that there's no like single way to do it and people around the world are doing it differently. I think that was nice. And I tried to bring that back when I came to the US. Like, you don't have to like think about, I don't know, whatever the influencers online are doing or these parenting hacks or something, because there really are just like a million different ways to be a mom because there are a million different, people are different, mothers are different, we're different humans. So I think that was very, very freeing in some ways too.
What parallels can you draw from your experience to the women that you observed and wrote about? Who can you identify the most with?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, to some extent, I identified with all of them, really, really liked all of them. They were just, and I mean, I also give them like an enormous amount of credit for doing this. You know, they opened up to me through their entire first year of motherhood, and they were all just, that was amazing of them to do. And I think I was in some ways exploring my own motherhood by listening to their stories. I think I found it interesting how similar some of the things were. You know, you had these very different, different people in very different places, but their sort of initial response to motherhood, I found it very identifiable. Like I think all of them or almost all of them sort of said like, I can't believe I'm someone's mom now. Like right after they gave birth, it was like they had prepared for this moment and they'd been thinking about what they were going to do, but then the moment came and it was just so sort of like disorienting. And in that process of sort of realigning your identity around that, I found incredibly universal, I guess. It really is a period of transition. And so for all of them, so like this one, the woman in Kenya is a 24-year-old in the middle of Nairobi, very different circumstance in some ways. I mean, she had lost her parents right before she gave birth. It was a very sort of emotional experience for her. And then the woman in Utah who, she was leaving the church and she was thinking, like also dealing with a lot of stuff, but a completely different set of circumstance. But both of them, I mean, said like almost the same exact words, like, how am I someone's mom now? And I just love that. I love that it's so universal and there's this sort of beauty in that, in this community of mothers around the world that I also felt the same way. And it really sort of upped for me how normal I am and all these feelings are normal and everyone feels them. And I just really love that.
Yeah, I like that too, how the motherhood experience is so universal, the feelings and all of that. What's different is the systemic structures, the political support, and, the leave that you get from your work, this and that's different, in all of the places. And I think that's so beautiful that you weaved those two together and we can clearly see where the problem is.
Yeah, yeah, that was totally the goal well, I guess that was the goal. I mean, I was sort of like following what happened, but I think ultimately that is what came out of the project. It was just so clear that, yeah, there's this universality to motherhood and probably down through the generations, which is like very cool to think about too, grandmothers and great grandmothers feeling these same things. But yeah, like completely different circumstances and different things that can either sort of increase or alleviate anxiety. I mean, I think anxiety was also a thread through a lot of this, postpartum depression, but also anxiety and just these. And so, yeah, I mean, the woman in Kenya, she really struggled with those feelings and she had 3 months paid leave. So it was better than, most women in the US and certainly the US mom who I profiled. But, she went back to work and it was hard. She was trying to pump, but didn't have a place to pump. And someone walked in on her and then her boss got upset with her because she had to leave to take care of her infant daughter when she got sick. And it just became this whole sort of tragedy in some ways because, she ends up getting fired from her job. And it's basically because she's become a mother. I mean, just like talk about not supporting working mothers. It was just so obvious. So yeah, you really do see how much difference it makes. The women in Finland and Japan who had generous leave and also daycare, public daycare, they just didn't confront the same problems. They had their own stuff. The woman in Finland is going through sort of a difficult breakup but what I thought was interesting about that was that she felt a certain amount of freedom to leave a relationship that wasn't working for her. And I think partly that was because she had so much public support. She could survive as a single mom. It was going to be okay. Whereas it was much harder for the woman in Kenya who ended up being a single mom. And even the woman in the US, when she had some trouble in her marriage, it was just there's different considerations if you don't have the strong public support. So it like in every aspect of your life, these things matter, these policies matter. So yeah, it was fascinating.
And how did you choose the women?
I wanted them to be sort of similar at the beginning of the year, like first time moms, generally middle class, sort of in a relatively urban environment or close to a city. I think that's partly just because that represents most people in the world. And so I wanted it to be somewhat representative. And then also, so you could see sort of how much difference motherhood makes in their lives when they start out in roughly the same place. And they all had babies. I mean, it was sort of amazing. They all had babies within like, I guess, weeks of each other, if not days. Some of them were days. It's all January 2022 at the beginning of the calendar year. And so there were certain like parameters I was, just characteristics of these women I was looking for. And I wanted it to be geographically representative. I liked that, you have someone in Europe and the US and Asia and Africa just to really cover the globe. And then I worked with local reporters to help me find them. So they were also, again, like really wonderful, amazingly good at their jobs. And they helped me follow them throughout the year too. So when I couldn't be there, like in country with them, these local reporters went and did reporting and they took videos and photos. And then I was just sort of in constant touch with the women. I had at least one like very big conversation with them every month, but also like throughout I'd also be in touch with them more than that. So yeah.
How do you think this experience helped them or benefited them in what ways? I can imagine that if they are signing up for this project, they can see changes in themselves as well. Did they share anything? Did you observe or, maybe assumptions you might have?
I think on the whole, like I give them a lot of credit for just making the time during that year. And it was probably something of a sacrifice for them to do it. But I think at the beginning, and hopefully still, they're pretty bought into the project, like the idea that it's important to talk about early motherhood and women's experience. I think they all were bought into that. As I said, like my early motherhood experience was somewhat lonely day to day. I think that's not uncommon. And so I think it was nice for them. I hope it was nice for them to have someone to talk to, someone who was really interested in sort of the minutia of like life with an infant, which can be boring or, whatever to someone who's not experienced it or not interested in it. Although I found all of their experiences really interesting. I mean, I think there's this idea that like early motherhood's boring, but I think it's like totally fascinating because you go through so many changes. But yeah, I hope that for them, it was nice to have someone to talk to sort of on a regular basis and that I hope also and think they should be proud of what, was produced from it. I think it's really important to talk about this stuff. And I give them credit for being so brave that they shared their own stories publicly like that.
What were the biggest surprises for you? Like from which country did you feel like you observed or learned like surprising things?
Well, Finland and Kenya were certainly the most unfamiliar to me, but they also are really interesting places to look at this stuff. I think Finland and sort of all the Nordic countries, they provide like really great examples of what can be done, especially around gender. Like it was so fascinating to learn about the egalitarian relationships there and sort of, there's this phenomenon. There are these latte papas. There are these men, these dads who like go out with their kids because they also get long parental leave. And so they become like very, good parents. And there's this idea that there's a right, fathers have a right to time with their kids and kids have a right to time with their fathers and just sort of thinking about all that stuff. And I thought it was sort of funny. There was in romance novels now, like latte papas have become characters because like they're desirable for being like good dads, which was so, I don't know, is not that it's un-American, but it was just a different way of thinking about this stuff. And I sort of love that. And they want to do the intergenerational trauma work with like dads now. So I really loved that. And my husband, he like read the book sort of early on. And I think he responded to that, was like, that's like, these are cool ideas, So I think that was really fun to learn about. And then in Kenya, I just thought it was interesting how I really liked learning about the traditional methods of sort of community and child raising and how that's changed with colonialism and now with sort of the modern life that's sort of become in some ways more American. It's like taken on the American model in part of like healthcare. So there's like really good private healthcare and then not so good public care. And, just how we sort of export our ideas to these other countries, even with abortion and reproductive rights, like what happens here it's really profound impact on people, around the world. And it's another reason why like it's important that America be a leader on these issues because, it affects people so in so many different places. So yeah, all of those things were fascinating to me. I didn't know any of that before I started.
Are you looking for personalized support on your parenting journey? I offer one-on-one coaching tailored to your needs. including court-ordered parenting classes and co-parenting counseling. These services are available to anyone, no matter where you live, whether in the United States or abroad. As a special thank you to my listeners, you can enjoy 10% off all coaching packages. Visit authenticparenting.com to learn more about my services and how we can work together to achieve your parenting goals. If you could choose to live in one of the 4 countries and do the motherhood journey all over again, where would you go?
That's a great question. I mean, it's funny when people hear about my book, they always say like, well, should we all just move to Finland? You know, like, did they solve it? And in some ways, yeah, the public system there is really great, but I still have like so much love for the US. You know, I really think it's such a incredible, has the potential to be a really amazing country for families. There is, you know, the freedom we have here to do things however we like is really important. I really felt it moving back from Japan. So, and I think the sort of tragedy of the US is that people who have it good here, like people who work for big companies, big tech companies, you know, who have really generous benefits, they get, you know, 6 months or whatever it is paid leave and, you know, sometimes even help with childcare and all of this stuff. I think that's great. The problem is that it's not extended to everyone. So yeah, so I don't want to like count out the US. I still have hope that it can get better, but like I guess as it stands now, like Finland is pretty good.
Can you talk about societal expectations? Because it seems like in all of the countries, you know, those 4 women were faced with societal expectations. And also, I'm really curious about the very gendered approach to motherhood, parenthood in Japan. That was really, it wasn't shocking because I had interviewed another person several years ago on the podcast. It's called The Japanese Way of Parenting. I can't remember the guest's name, unfortunately. And I remember that it was, you know, it's all the women's job and all of this, like how men are not almost participatory in the raising of the kids. And I want to hear more about that, like what you observed firsthand and the societal expectations, how all women face that.
Yeah, it's definitely true. I mean, there's such a gender divide as far as domestic work and child raising, and it really is sort of the woman's job to do all of that. You know, I think it's like women do 7 times more work in the home than men. It's the most of any developed country, most uneven. There's just these gender roles that exist. And, you know, I think it's hard for men too. The work culture is really intense. So they're sort of expected to be at work all the time, really long hours, and then going out with her boss afterward to drinks. I mean, so it's hard to maintain a good family life. And you see these surveys now of young Japanese men who want to be more involved, and they're trying to figure out the government now, like the birth rate's dropping. And I think many people think it's because of some of this stuff. Like women are just, it's too onerous to take on motherhood. It's way too much. And the woman that I profiled there, it was the same way. Like she wanted to have more than one kid, but in the end, like one was so overwhelming that she wasn't going to. And so anyway, so one thing that Japan is doing is trying to get men more involved. They are trying to encourage men to take paternity leave. But yeah, it's hard. The thing that I learned that I thought was really interesting too was how this sort of all this stuff happened like right after World War II. And partly it was because women during the war were sort of expected to send their sons off to war, like with, you know, do anything for the country, you know, and not more in the loss of their sons and all of this stuff. And then afterwards, there was this big women's movement to like what they called reclaim motherhood. So take it away from the state. They wanted to, you know, set the terms for it. They wanted the state to make policies to help. And so that was a lot of the sort of support systems that they have now sort of were to recover from the devastation of the war, but also guided by this idea that like motherhood is important and women should be in control of it. So it came from this like very interesting place of women trying to assert control over motherhood. But what ended up happening in some ways was that it just became this like what's called gender essentialism, that women could only be moms and dad and men could only be workers. And so I found that fascinating just to think about like how to make a better system. And sometimes you like start in the right place and then it sort of veers off into this really problematic situation. But yeah, you feel it even today for sure. I mean, there's just so much expectation on moms. There's no babysitters really, sort of like seen as a dereliction of duty if you like have someone else take care of your kids and all of that stuff, and as I said, like no pain medication during birth, just women should like sort of bear the pain. So it's hard. It's a hard place in some ways to be a mom, even though there's all these incredible support systems for families. Yeah. So it's interesting to think about.
How did the women themselves feel about those gender roles and stereotypes and the expectations, do you think? Were they aware of it? Do they want to fight against it, or sort of they accept that's the way it is and they perpetuate this pattern? What did you learn or observe?
I think women are sort of grateful on the one hand that they have like a long parental leave and that there's daycares and they know that, other countries don't have that was my sense, so that Japan has it good in some ways. But I think in a lot of ways, yeah, women recognize that this is not right. There was a prime minister recently who said like during maternity leave, women should like pick up other skills so they're better workers when they return. And moms just like went nuts. Like, what are you talking about? I'm going to like retrain to do something while I'm taking care of a baby. And I think there's just this sense that the government, which is like trying to get them to have more kids and all this stuff, is like completely out of touch with what mothers really want. Totally think that's true. And people see sort of, there's a lot of like international families in Tokyo. And so I think there's a lot of exchange of ideas and thinking about like, it doesn't have to be this way. And the other big thing that's happening in Japan is that a lot more women are working. Like I think the numbers now are higher than the US, even for women's participation in the workforce. But at the same time, like all this stuff about domestic work hasn't changed. And so I do think there's a growing understanding that like, okay, we can't do both. Like we can't do all the work at home and be like completely, participating in the workforce as, women want to work, but also the economy needs women to work. So something has to give. And I think it's really around the role of men. It like comes, non-birthing partners. It really has to do with like making things more equal and sort of getting past this idea of like men are just going to work around the clock to provide for their families. It's just unsustainable. There needs to be more work-life balance.
There was, you wrote about this like story in your book, how you are at this daycare and, there was a question, what did you do before motherhood? And you sort of had a strong reaction to that. Can you share that story and like what happened inside you and or did you react like that?
Yeah, it was my son's daycare, and I think I was pregnant with my second when this happened or something. Anyway, I remember being pregnant. It was in my second or third. But yeah, so it was like the beginning of the year introductory session and all the parents are supposed to come, but parents is like only moms. I mean, it was all moms. And then and I think I was the only non-Japanese person. And the principal was sort of doing an intro thing and said, okay, let's go around now. And everyone tell us what you did before becoming a mommy. It was like, this idea that like you had a life before you were a mom and it probably involved working and then you became a mom and then now your identity is mom and that's it. And we all have the same identity. And it was sort of like share an interesting anecdote about your past that no, and it just made me like so uncomfortable. And I think I was already sort of upset about, I was in Japan and like it was harder for me to work there than it had been in the US. And like I had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder anyway, but I was just so like annoyed by it. Like, I was a journalist and I am still a journalist and a mommy, as you say, and I think there were a couple other like moms who maybe had the same response because I remember one other woman was like, well, I'm a doctor. It was just such a sort of old school way of looking at moms and talking to them. But it happened so often to me, stuff like that, that just, it really got under my skin. And, but again, like the thing that I did sort of realize, or I tried to rationalize later was that like, there's a respect for mothers there that doesn't really exist in the US, I think certainly to the same degree. So I think maybe it was just sort of like, she was trying to signal that like, yeah, motherhood is kind of a full-time job, and that's fine. And so I sort of give the principal the benefit of the doubt in that way that it was like, now you're mom and that's like a really important role. So what did you do before? But there was something in that moment that just really, it bothered me. Yeah.
How about this the no pain medication and like tell me about that. How did you personally feel about that? And do you regret that experience? I mean,
Well, yeah, I mean, so interestingly, there's one OB/GYN doctor in Tokyo, pretty much one who sort of caters to the expat community. And his calling cards that he speaks English and Spanish and he provides pain medication and he like does it all. So he delivers the babies, he's the anesthesiologist. I mean, it's all sort of crazy. And he delivers at different hospitals. So he's like going from hospital to hospital at night, delivering different women's babies. But when I moved to Japan and I posted on, like a local English speaking mothers group, like, who should I go to? Everyone was like, oh, you have to go to, Dr. Sakamoto. So I went to him. So my experience was slightly different from the typical Japanese woman who'd like just had no access to it. For me, I was just happy to like have the choice if I wanted it. And I used it with my first and didn't with my second too. And that was just, but knowing that it was available was good. And, the woman I profiled like did not have that choice. And it was very hard for her. She was really nervous going into birth. Like she was having these nightmares and just about the pain of birth. And people had told her how hard it was. And then her husband couldn't be there with her when she was giving birth because it was sort of the very end of COVID. And Japan was really restrictive about that kind of stuff, sort of in keeping with the whole like anti-woman kind of thing. They relaxed other restrictions, but not restrictions on women and, birthing women. So she was alone with no pain medication and just it was pretty awful. Like, compared to all three of the other women, I mean, the woman in Kenya couldn't afford pain medication, so that was also really hard. But just, yeah, it's very hard. And then I do think that there is this expectation that women just sort of bear the pain of a lot of this stuff, and you do it for the sake of your child. Like whatever is good for the kid is sort of that's your guiding star. It's not what's good for the mother. And I thought it was really interesting that in Finland, the public health nurse told the mom there, like, make sure that you're comfortable so that you can take care of your child. Or I think those were the words, but it was something like that. Like it's very important for the mom to be happy and comfortable because she'll be a better mother essentially to her baby. And that seems like a much more rational approach than, expecting moms just to like bear the pain. And yeah, so yeah, it's super interesting, like part of the whole thing, the pain medication. I think it really indicates something larger about society.
Yeah, that was very interesting. So, with the exception of few Pacific Island nations, the United States is the only country in the world without mandated paid maternity leave. Why is that? Who is working to keep it that way? And what can be done to change that? This is a really big question.
I know.
And give us the
It's a
answers to this
question.
million-dollar question.
Yeah, that's true. You see it when you go around the world. Like we are definitely the exception, but there has been a movement here to get paid leave for like over 100 years. I mean, back, when Finland was first implementing its policy in 1918 or 19, there were women in the US working to try to get it passed here. And it sort of, at that time, it didn't go anywhere because I guess it was sort of more like Japan. There was mostly an expectation that women would stay in the home. They didn't sort of want to provide women help to be working. And this was particularly for white women. For Black women, it was more a sense that they should be working but weren't going to get any sort of special supports to do it. So yeah, we really sort of all these sexist and racist ideas. And then you fast forward to like the 1970s, women sort of had to work. We needed two incomes. And so there really was a very strong push again to get paid leave. But that time the opposition was more coming from sort of corporate interests. And there was even this document I found. It was like the National Association of Manufacturers. It was some business lobby, and they basically told Congress they weren't going to subsidize parenthood. So they were saying, like, we're not going to pay for any of this stuff, and we don't want you to pass any paid leave bills that are going to force us to do something to pay, women not to work. So, and if that was very successful, like they were able to keep Congress from passing a national bill, these, corporate interests. And that's sort of been true ever since the FMLA, which is what we have now, the it's not paid. And that was a concession to the business lobby. And it only applies to women in government positions and at big companies. So we just have this, it was because in that case, the business lobby got upset. The interesting thing that has happened recently is that, sort of as I mentioned, these Silicon Valley tech companies now use paid leave and other benefits as a way to recruit employees. So the best women employees and also men, because they have paternity leave often, they want to work for these companies. And so they've discovered that actually it's not bad for business. It's really good for business, but that puts small businesses at a disadvantage. So a lot of the paid leave bills, like in states, they're supported by small businesses because those, they can't keep employees. The employees want to go work for Target or some, sort of big conglomerate because they need the benefits. And I talked to a congressman and he told me that he had approached tech companies and tried to get them on board to support a national paid leave policy, and they didn't want to. They wanted to keep this as a competitive advantage. So, I think really thinking about advocating on this issue is very important. It's not fair that some people in our society have good benefits and some people don't. It's not just a question of economic inequality, it's also inequality of benefits. And, these companies keeping it for themselves is not good for the health of our democracy to have that kind of inequality. And also, I think if you do have good paid leave, you should recognize that that's a privilege and that you should sort of advocate for everyone. It's really important that there's more equality on these things in the US. And hopefully there's some movement. I mean, the paid leave at the state level, it is happening. But as I say, I think it's really important that it happens nationally so that you don't have so much inequality.
Yeah. What other changes do you think needs to happen to make this, parenthood, motherhood experience better? What could we like implement from other countries and better our society? If you had a magic wand or if it was up to you to design it, what are some things that you learned, some main things that you can say, yes, I wish it was this, this, this.
Yeah. I mean, the three areas that I looked at were sort of birth and maternal health care, and
Mm-hmm.
then paid leave and universal childcare. And I think those are the three big issues that we should focus on as families. So just childcare is a huge one. It's so expensive. And there's data showing that, American families aren't having as many kids as they would like because they can't afford childcare. It's like hard to study sort of, but it seems like that's what's happening in some ways. It's astronomically expensive. And that's partly because we never invested in public childcare. And so what's happened is like private equity has come in and invested in these private daycare chains, and now they charge exorbitant amounts of money. It's like on average $14,000 a year for one child. And so, it can be more than all your other stuff, like your rent, whatever, the cost of childcare. It's really an area where I think we could do better. And again, interestingly, like there's been a lot of advocacy around this issue for generations. And there were two times during World War II and then with Nixon where we came really close to getting national public childcare. And it was the same sort of forces that came in and, women shouldn't be working anyway. Why are we subsidizing childcare? And then later there was some issues around like whether daycare should be segregated in the South. This was an issue that came up in Congress and they couldn't sort of make a decision about it. And it ended up like they couldn't go anywhere. That was after World War II. And then with Nixon, he was going to sign a universal childcare bill that basically would have expanded Head Start. So like everyone could use it on a sliding scale basis for cost. But in that case, the conservative sort of wing of his party rebelled and got really upset. And they said it was a plan to like, communist ideas to our youth and brainwash the youth with all sorts of stuff. And so it didn't go anywhere. There was like these letter writing campaigns from religious groups that said, we don't want daycare, like, families should do it. So we come close and then these same forces sort of come up and block it. But I think just seeing what a difference it made in the lives of women having affordable childcare, not having to think about that kind of thing. It also, yeah, in Finland and Japan, it just relieves so much of the stress on families and the mental sort of load of women to have to figure out, sort of piece it together from 0 to 5. And I think in this country, you're so exhausted by the time your kid is like school aged that you can't, I think people are kind of done with like thinking about advocating for anything at that point. You're like, all right, I'm out of here. Like, I'm on to like not having to worry about childcare. But it's really important that we sort of advocate on those issues and that, we involve men and other allies to get involved. people without kids too, who may someday have kids. I think just sort of bringing it to the front of some of these movements, the feminist movement and all that, making parenthood an important part of that. Yeah, I sort of think it's the future. I think that's the way that public discourse should go, and thinking about how much pain it's caused American families and how we can fix it is so important.
Yeah, who are the advocates currently? I mean, it's hard for individual mothers or families to do that work, right? It's like you said, it's the last thing that you want to do. But who are the advocates now whose responsibility it is? How can change happen?
Yeah, I know it's a lot to take on. I mean, if people want to get involved, there's a group called the Chamber of Mothers. I think it's like a take on the Chamber of Commerce, but they have local chapters and they are working on all these issues. And so, it's a good way to get involved in organized sort of advocacy work without having to do it yourself, you know, and probably meet like-minded mothers. I think that's great. And in Congress, there are people who have been doing this forever. Senator Patty Murray is wonderful, and she has been doing it for decades. So there are people advocating, but I think showing some support for those issues is definitely important. And a lot of this stuff also happens at the state level. So just figuring out what's going on in your state, like New Mexico was the first state to do universal daycare, and it's because their governor made it a priority. So that's like a great place to look for models for other states and different funding mechanisms for that sort of thing. Yeah, but like you said, it is hard to get to do it yourself. So I think joining an organization and just sort of making yourself aware of what's going on locally is really important.
Yeah. And last question, are you still in touch with the four mothers that showcase in your book?
Yeah, I mean, to varying degrees, like Chelsea, the woman in Kenya, I actually am in touch with the most. She's great and she's just sort of like interested in sharing what's going on in her life. And I like that. So we text sometimes and yeah, I sort of know what's happening with her. Tsukasa, the woman in Japan, actually doesn't speak English, and my Japanese is only sort of good. So the whole time, all the interviews were done through a translator. So we communicate the least, but sometimes we do. And then, yeah, Anna, Sarah, who are Finland and the US, we're in touch sometimes. And they're like, I feel like we have a very warm relationship. Honestly, I try not to bother them too much because they're like busy with their kids and they like committed so much time to the project. But yeah, I'm in touch with them to some extent. And they all seem great and their kids are 3 now. So it's very cool to see them grow up. The kids are hitting the developmental stuff at the same time, but like in totally different places. It's very, very still really interesting to me to watch that. So yeah, and just as I said, they brought so much to this project and to this book, and I am just like incredibly grateful to them for doing it.
Yeah, you know what I was thinking? This could be a very interesting documentary. If somebody wants to make it, that would be great.
I would be happy to work with whoever wants to make it.
Yay. Hey, if you're listening and you're a documentary maker,
Yeah,
yeah, I would love to see that documentary. I think reading is one thing, but seeing the culture, the scenery, the colors, the textures, and the language and everything, it would be a much, a deeper, intense experience for the viewer
yeah.
and for the reader. You
No,
know,
that's true. And I took photos of them throughout the year too. So there are these really beautiful photos, and a few of them are in the book at the end. They're black and white, but they're in color. But yeah, I think it would just be, yes, there's so much material there to think about visually for sure.
yeah, definitely. Is there anything else that you want to impart, a message or something that is in your heart or
I guess I just want mothers to feel a sense of community, an international community. People are there, they're feeling the same stuff you are, even the minute details of like feeling like you're just constantly sort of, I don't know, I loved that all the women had the very similar experiences. And so I like to think about that too when I'm going through stuff, that there is a community out there, people who are feeling the same way you do, and whatever you're feeling is normal and been felt before, and that you also have agency to work with other mothers and other parents and members of a community to change it. And, there are great models to look to around the world, traditional models, also, ways of bringing that into modern life. And so I really think we could all, it's sort of a hopeful message that like this can be better. So there is a community, and if we work together, we can this experience, yeah, sort of better and the best it can be. So we can really take joy in our time with our kids, which is ultimately like really, I think, the goal in some ways, just to enjoy motherhood.
Yeah, I just keep thinking about something silly. What if there was a book like 11 hard lessons about motherhood you're about to discover and write it
Yeah.
for new moms? I don't think that will do very well, but I don't know. Do you think, I don't know, is there value in sharing, you know, the hardships that are about to embark, with a new mom? I feel like it will not land. This is something like you need to go through
Mm.
yourself because when you are on this is how I think. I'm curious how you think. Like when you're on this threshold of becoming a new mom, you have your rosy glasses on. You're so, you know, it's so different. Your hopes and expectations and fantasies and dreams, but then the reality hits. And I'm not sure if somebody told me about the reality would have made a difference in my experience, but
Yeah.
I could be wrong. So, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I know. I've thought about this too. I don't think it would have made a difference. I think because you can't really prepare for it. It's just so life-changing. It's like, what are you going to do? How are you going to like really, and what are you going to do? Like, it's going to happen one way or the other. And I think experiencing it is, but I think talking about it is good, especially if you're going through it already, feeling that sense of community and commiseration is really important. I did think it was interesting. Someone I talked to in Finland was, a researcher there was telling me that like there was all this American content on social media about how hard parenthood is. And, it was people in Finland were watching it but it was so like situational to the US, but that wasn't sort of being understood in Finland. Like because it's in some ways easier, right, in Finland because you have more support. And so people there were like, oh my goodness, like parenthood is going to be so hard. This is like and it was sort of turning them off when in fact, like, the experience was just very different because they were in a totally different country. So I thought that was sort of funny just to think about like how social media can really affect your perceptions of these things, but it really matters like sort of where you are locally in some ways. So yeah, that was just sort of an aside that I thought was interesting. I don't know. I had different reactions to the book in that way too. Like one person said to me like, "Oh, this is going to make people not want to have kids because you really get like all the sort of sense of what it is." But then someone else said to me like, "I read the book and it made me want to have a kid. Like I never thought I did, but then I wanted to because I thought it was so like just this incredible like the moment of birth and how all the women responded and just this huge thing that like she didn't want to miss or something like that." So I don't know. I think people respond to the idea of something being challenging and complicated differently anyway. So it's hard to make generalizations, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. But what I think is nice is that we're not alone, and motherhood is a universal experience. And the feelings, the guilt, the loneliness, the isolation, the identity shift, the sense of loss that comes with it, and who you are, and all of those things. And are you someone's mother? It's so comforting to know that part is very human and universal.
Oh, totally. And the other thing that was universal that people pointed out to me and that I guess I realized other people saw it very clearly was like how much joy they all took in their children too. It was really hard, but they all were so committed to their kids and found so much meaning and these moments of like total pleasure. So it's both, which is just what's sort of amazing about the whole thing, I guess. Yeah, I thought it was really fascinating, all of those, just the commonalities across culture and yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing this conversation with me, for writing the book, and for all the hard work that went into into the project. I can only imagine, being a mom to three kids and then doing all this. And I'm sure there were, emotionally challenging moments for you too, with different parts of the books or themes, your own traumas and things like that. And I hope it was a worthwhile journey for you in terms of your own personal development.
So, I mean, it's been great for me. I'm so glad to be on this side of it, I guess, and now sharing it with the world. And I really appreciate you taking an interest in all your great questions. It was really so nice to talk to you about it. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, and thank you. That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you found this episode helpful and inspiring. Be sure to hit that follow button so you don't miss future episodes, and take a moment to leave a rating and review. It really helps others find the show. I would love to hear your thoughts and takeaways. Join the conversation in the Authentic Parenting Facebook group or visit the contact page at authenticparenting.com/contact to get in touch. Authentic Parenting is an ad-free show, and your donations is what makes this podcast possible. Support the show by visiting authenticparenting.com/support or becoming a patron at patreon.com. Your contributions make it possible for me to continue bringing you weekly episodes. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.